Hey guys, tonight we're heading to New Jersey. It's the 1970s. Disco fever is peaking, the air is heavy with cheap cologne and lighter fluid, and somewhere amid the mirrored walls and sticky floors of Bergen County, is a man named Bonaparte, is running a nightclub. That's not a metaphor. He's not an Elvis impersonator or a guy with delusions of grandeur. His last name is literally Bonaparte. And yes, he's actually related to that Napoleon you're about to spend the night. Under a flickering neon sign that reads Club Bonaparte, where every drink comes with a story and every bathroom has at least one plumbing issue, you'll stand at the threshold of a place that smells like French cologne and damp shag carpet. And behind the bar, a guy who claims his great-great-uncle was once emperor of the French, now polishing martini glasses in a powder blue tuxedo. Probably won't survive this not because it's dangerous, but because the secondhand embarrassment may liquefy your soul. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere interesting, post your city and local time down in the comments. I love seeing where we all gather for these strange little sleep journeys. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start in the parking lot. The pavement is cracked, a little weedy around the edges. The painted sign out front has lost several letters to time and weather, so it currently reads Club Bon __ Tay, like some avant-garde art project. The building itself is squat and rectangular, with an exterior best described as gas. Station chic, but inside, there's a velvet rope and a doorman who's mostly just trying to quit smoking. You pass through mirrored doors into a burst of canned fog, and a light show that was probably state-of-the-art when Nixon was still in office. The smell hits you first: disinfectant, leatherette booths, and some lingering trace of garlic knots from the restaurant this place used to be. A glittering disco ball rotates solemnly above a nearly empty dance floor. It's a Thursday, and there he is behind the bar. He's tallish, well-groomed, very proud of his sideburns. He introduces himself as Charles Bonaparte, or sometimes Prince Charles, depending on how many scotch and sodas he's had. I've got the accent of someone raised in New Jersey prep schools, but who has deep feelings about Bordeaux. Blazer has epaulets. You ask him why he opened a nightclub. He tells you it was destiny. That's how we meet Charles Joseph Bonaparte Gifford, or Charlie to his friends. Direct descendant of Jérôme Bonaparte, youngest brother of Napoleon. You didn't know Napoleon had a little brother? Most people don't. But it turns out the Bonaparte family tree has more branches than a Jersey oak, and one particularly weird sparkly twig leads straight to this nightclub, where family legacy meets promotional margarita nights. Historians agree that Napoleon had 7 siblings, and Jérôme, born in 1784, was the baby of the brood. While Napoleon was busy redrawing maps and terrifying half of Europe, little Jérôme was falling in love with opera epaulets and eventually an American teenager. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Tonight is about tracing that glitter. Trail backwards from disco lights to dim candlelit halls in France, and from polyester pantsuits to powdered wigs, you slide into a booth. The faux leather creaks. The DJ announces another banger from KC and the Sunshine Band, but you're too deep in thought. How does a French aristocrat end up in a polyester tux trying to convince skeptical New Jerseyans to dance to the Bee Gees under the watchful gaze of a framed Napoleon portrait? Well, it starts with a family who thought they'd rule forever. Ends with one descendant serving champagne to 2-for-1 coupon holders. Historians still argue whether Charles's claim to nobility was more ambition than truth. Genealogical records are fuzzy, especially when filtered through decades of secondhand storytelling and American embellishment. But what's undisputed is that Jérôme Bonaparte did marry an American woman, and their descendants did settle. In the U.S., largely in Maryland and New Jersey, so it's not completely impossible that the guy now wiping down the bar has royal blood, just heavily diluted by diner food and Bruce Springsteen. You glance around the club again. There are French flags hanging above the bar, a bizarre mini guillotine sculpture in the corner, and a promotional sign for Revolutionary Friday's free cover for anyone in powdered wigs. No one ever shows up in costume, except once. And that guy was swiftly escorted out after demanding liberté for the shrimp cocktail. The truth is, Charles, or Whoever he really is was chasing something. Maybe legacy. Maybe limelight. Maybe just a way to stand out in a decade where everyone was standing on light-up floors already. He tells you that Club Bonaparte was supposed to bring a touch of European glamour to the tri-state scene. What he actually brought was a disco ball ordered from a bankrupt cruise ship, and a drink menu with something called the Waterloo Wallbanger. Outside, the neon flickers again. One of the ES gives up for good. You sip your drink. The night deepens, and the tale of how we got here is just getting started. You lean back in the booth as Prince Charles, as he insists, adjusts the lighting to maximum romance, which mainly just turns the disco ball into a disorienting flashlight. You're ready now, nestled in fake leather, half-lulled by the Bee Gees, to hear the story from the beginning. It starts not with flashing lights or polyester, but with cannon fire and powdered wigs. Jérôme Bonaparte, born in 1784, was the youngest of Napoleon's siblings, some would say, the spare parts prince. While his big brother carved out empires and rewrote the laws of Europe in between angry letters to his tailor, Jérôme preferred the finer things: music, art, fancy uniforms, not showing up on time for military drills. But even as a young man, Jérôme was the handsome one, the Bonaparte brother most likely to be voted best hair in Corsica. He had that winning blend of boyish charm and dangerous ineptitude that tends to break hearts in economies. Didn't want to be a general. Wanted to wear the uniform, strut dramatically, and then sneak out of battle to go flirt with someone. Historians still argue whether he was merely feckless or actively allergic to responsibility. But then comes 1803. Jérôme, now in the French Navy, arrives in America. He's 20, handsome, and technically a prince, though France hadn't sorted out what to do with all its leftover royalty after the Revolution. In Baltimore, he meets a 17-year-old local beauty named Elizabeth Patterson, known to friends as Betsy. She's sharp, ambitious, fashionable, not remotely interested in the average American suitor. Their meeting is a historical rom-com waiting to happen. She's reading a French novel in a salon. He's pretending to understand English. Sparks fly. Or, at the very least, wigs shift slightly. Within weeks, they're inseparable. Within months, married. And not just casually married, full mass. Rings, witnesses, imported wine. They even get a wedding announcement published in the Baltimore American. It's very public, very scandalous. Now remember, Napoleon is back in Europe, extremely busy waging wars, drafting laws, and micromanaging things like spoon designs. He hears about Jérôme's little American escapade via diplomatic whispers, and he is not thrilled. Napoleon had plans for his siblings mainly to use them as political pawns, marrying them off to European nobility like chess pieces with better tailoring. An American commoner? A merchant's daughter? Absolutely not. Napoleon responds the way all brothers do when their youngest sibling impulsively marries a girl from across the ocean. He sends angry letters, cancels credit accounts, and declares the marriage null and void retroactively. Actually pressures the Pope to annul the marriage. Papal annulments, by the way, are not known for their speed. This one came express delivery. You get the sense that Napoleon was less concerned with theology and more with branding. Jérôme tries to defend Betsy, but he's no match for his brother's imperial tantrums. He returns to Europe. Betsy, now pregnant, isn't even allowed to disembark the ship in France. She's turned away like a would-be nightclub guest without the right shoes. She returns to America, humiliated, but not broken. She gives birth to a son, Jérôme Napoleon Bonaparte, named Beau, and begins a long, awkward life as Baltimore's former princess. Think Real Housewives of 19th century Maryland, but with more embroidery and deeply sarcastic drawing room conversations. Meanwhile, Jérôme folds like a damp crepe. He marries the German princess his brother picks out for him and is installed as king of Westphalia, new experimental kingdom carved out of some reluctant German territories.
Oh, yes.
Basically builds this country from leftover parts, then hands it to Jérôme like a shiny toy. Try not to crash it, you imagine him saying. Back at Club Bonaparte, Charles pours you another drink. He's named it the Betsy Breeze. It's mostly gin and regret. He smiles fondly when he mentions her name, Betsy, as if she were a beloved aunt who once wore silks, carried a parasol, could cut a man in half with a single glance. There's a framed portrait of her above the bar. In it, Betsy looks serene, composed, vaguely disapproving, as though she knows about this nightclub and is silently judging every sequin. The dance floor remains mostly empty, save for a couple doing a slow sway to something that was never meant for swaying. You can't help but wonder what Betsy would have made of this place, her descendant running. A French-themed discotheque with bad acoustics and a lighting scheme that makes everyone look slightly green. Probably would have laughed elegantly. The Bonaparte family, after all, is full of stories like this: grand entrances, dramatic exits, and someone always forgetting to pay the bill. And Germ. Well, his American chapter was over, but the consequences had only begun. That son he had with Betsy Boyo would grow up American, always just adjacent to royalty, never accepted in France, never fully belonging in America, always carrying a last name too famous for comfort. You sip your drink and wonder if that's the real reason Club Bonaparte exists. It's not just a vanity project, not just a business venture, but a place to belong, to create royalty, even if just for one sweaty, glittery Thursday night in Bergen County. You swirl the last of your Betsy breeze and try to piece together how we got from a royal scandal in Baltimore to a Mirrorball revolution in New Jersey. Charles still polishing a martini glass with excessive flare leans on the bar and says, it was all for love, the good kind, dramatic kind, the kind that ruins careers. And he's not wrong. Let's rewind. It's 1805 and Betsy Patterson Bonaparte is no longer allowed in France. She's back in Baltimore, highly pregnant, and being talked about in every tea circle from Boston to Savannah. There's something irresistible to Americans about a local girl who almost became a European princess. Almost is the operative word. Betsy gives birth to Jérôme Napoleon Bonaparte in London, technically in exile. She names him after his father and hopes, possibly naively, that Napoleon will come around and acknowledge the marriage. He doubles down. The marriage is erased in French legal terms like a smudge on a map. Betsy is written out of history on paper, but not in gossip. Definitely not in gossip. Back in Baltimore, Betsy decides not to become a tragic recluse. She becomes a character. Smart, acerbic, stylish. She wears the best silks. She speaks fluent French. She's the woman you want to sit next to at dinner if you enjoy perfectly timed shade. And she raises Beau with the best tutors, the best manners, and an enormous chip on his well-dressed shoulder. Meanwhile, in Europe, Jérôme is living his best and possibly worst life. He's now king of Westphalia, a newly minted satellite. Kingdom that Napoleon carves out after bullying several German princes into giving up their turf. Think of it as the IKEA of monarchies, stylish, expensive, slightly unstable. Jérôme's capital is Kassel, and his palace there is ridiculous. Lavish dinners, gilded furniture, and rumors of palace theatrics that would make Versailles blush. One fringe historian describes his court as operatic in scale and judgment. Whether that meant opera house or soap opera depends on the page. You turn Jérôme's governing style. Let's call it performative governance. He issues decrees about road repairs while commissioning 10 different tailor-made military uniforms, each with escalating amounts of braid and buttons. He raises taxes, throws lavish balls, and once reportedly performed in a musical pantomime. That's not satire, that's just Westphalia. Historians still argue whether Jérôme was trying to prove himself or simply didn't grasp the point of monarchy. On the plus side, he did abolish serfdom in Westphalia. On the minus side, he bankrupted. The kingdom trying to install gaslighting in every ballroom? Enlightenment, but make it literal. Back in Baltimore, Betsy watches this unfold through European newspapers and diplomatic letters. She files endless legal appeals trying to get financial support for BOA after all. He is Jérôme's son. French courts keep dodging, claiming technicalities, while Jérôme sends polite, but empty apologies from his mahogany writing desk. Beau grows up under this weird tension. He's technically European royalty, but practically American elite. Harvard educated, perfect French. Mild disdain for most things common. The Bonaparte genes run strong. charm, ambition, the uncanny ability to irritate bureaucrats. As the decades pass, Beau marries well, builds wealth, and maintains an air of elegant discontent. He never gets recognized by France as a legitimate heir, but that doesn't stop him from acting like one. He walks into rooms like he expects trumpets. He names his son Charles Joseph Bonaparte, after the emperor's brother Andy Venturier. Beloved nightclub bartender, that Charles grows up in a very different America, a more industrial one. He becomes a lawyer, then a reformer, then wait for it, Attorney General of the United States, under President Theodore Roosevelt, no less. In an era of mustaches and trust-busting, a Bonaparte from Baltimore is cleaning up corruption in Washington. He also founds the Bureau of Investigation. Yes, that bureau. It's the one that would later become the FBI, which means that somewhere in your FBI file, yes, you'll probably have, when there's a bureaucratic shadow, traceable to the guy who once ran Club Bonaparte. History is weird like that. Charles the Elder dies without fanfare. His descendants scatter. And a few generations later, one of them decides to reclaim the sparkle, reclaim the family myth, reclaim the fog machine. At this point, Charles, the nightclub owner, walks over, holding a Polaroid of himself in full military cosplay epaulets. Saber, French sash, confused poodle on a leash. He says it was for marketing Mondays. Did not catch on. You nod politely, sipping your drink, trying to imagine the conversations that led from an imperial bloodline to a Thursday night karaoke night featuring Napoleon-themed lyrics to ABBA songs. But somehow it makes sense. The Bonaparte line has always been about style over substance. It's drama over policy, and a relentless refusal to go quietly. Even in New Jersey. Even under strobe lights. And as you glance at the dance floor, where a lone disco enthusiast in a feathered vest is twirling like he's at Versailles, it hits you. Maybe Jérôme was never really out of place. It'd be glitter and bad decisions were always his true kingdom. The bartender Prince Charles, in case you've forgotten, leans back against the bar, lights another clove cigarette strictly for aesthetic authenticity, he claims, and starts telling you about the night his ancestors were officially erased from European inheritance rights. He says this like someone might say, and then the band played Freebird, with a hint of bravado and a flicker of theatrical doom. The year was 1806. Napoleon, now fully in charge of the French Empire and several adjacent European vibes, has just declared that his youngest brother Jérôme is not only officially married to a German princess, Katharina of Württemberg, but also that the American chapter of his life has been scrubbed cleaner than a Versailles mirror. Jérôme, despite occasional moody glances out of palatial windows, mostly accepts this new role. Betsy and Baby Beau, it's gone from the family album. Betsy doesn't take this lightly. She spends the next several sons American aristocracy, not French. Nobility, she's done with that. Instead, she pivots, she writes, socializes, fundraises, invests. She turns her exile into elegance and eventually becomes one of Baltimore's most fashionable, if asterisk slightly, acerbic asterisk, dowagers. She once said, "If I had been born in a different country, I should have ruled it." Just the kind of quote you get embroidered on throw pillows if you're feeling brave. Meanwhile, Jérôme's new German life is going as well as one might expect for a man with royal tastes and a deeply questionable skill set. He attends parades. He occasionally misplaces large sums of state money. He once gifts his wife a solid gold chamber pot, which sounds romantic until you remember the entire kingdom. It's running on borrowed francs. The Westphalian court is ... lavish, absurd, full of musicians, artists, consultants, and very confused. Diplomats. There's a story half documented, half mytha about a parade he threw where every soldier had to wear matching teal sashes, and the horses had coordinating ribbons. He may or may not have commissioned a perfume line called La Roi Jérôme. Historians still argue whether these choices were early branding genius or just a monarch with access to too many novelty tailors. And then there's the time Jérôme tried to implement the Napoleonic Code in his kingdom but forgot to translate large sections from French to German. The result? Dozens of Westphalian farmers, legally married to their goats, or so the local gossip went. You picture all of this unfolding in palaces lit like French department stores, while Betsy, thousands of miles away, hosts a tea party in Baltimore and tells guests with a gentle sigh, "He always did like feathers more than facts." But the years pass. Napoleon's empire begins to crumble. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813 spells disaster for Westphalia. Jérôme flees his kingdom in a custom coach with golden trim, is carrying his favorite uniforms, his perfume, and probably a small harpist. As the French Empire collapses, so too does Jérôme's brief taste of throne life. He spends the next few years bouncing around Europe, occasionally in exile, occasionally in style. In 1815, after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, Jérôme is stripped of his titles and lands. He's no longer a king, just a Bonaparte, brother of a former emperor. He's a man with expensive tastes and very few income streams. He tries to stay relevant by appearing at social events, writing long memoirs, and insisting on being called His Majesty at dinner parties. It works, poorly. Back in America, Betsy grows old with grace and mild vengeance. She lives to 1879, outliving many of her rivals, lovers, and most of her extended family. She refuses to remarry. She keeps all of Jérôme's letters in a red silk ribbon. She donates generously to charities, art museums, and anything involving literary societies. Her death is front-page news in the New York Times, and Beau. He thrives, sort of. He makes good money, marries into the Patterson family fortune, and raises his children with the kind of firm handshake and eyebrow-raising expectations that suggests he is very aware of his family's proximity to a throne. He's proud but practical, a Bonaparte with a Baltimore drawl. Eventually, one of his children, Charles Joseph Bonaparte, rises to national prominence, becoming a key figure in early 20th century American politics. And yet, through all of this achievement, the family seems unable to shake its one core obsession: legacy. Not just what you do, but how your name endures, how it echoes, how it glows on a marquee or hangs above a foggy nightclub, which brings us back to Club Bonaparte. Charles the bartender shows you a box of family heirlooms. It's mostly newspaper clippings and one exceptionally fake-looking royal crest. Holds it up with solemn pride. He says, "But the contractor misspelled Bonaparte as Bone Party." He sighs, "It's still there under the tiles." There's something poetic about that. The legacy miswritten, slightly ridiculous, buried beneath layers of polyester, pride, and linoleum. A metaphor hiding in plain sight, much like the family itself. You take another sip. The disco lights blur softly. Somewhere in the back corner, a drunk couple is slow dancing to a Donna Summer remix. It's easy to imagine Jérôme would have loved this place. No governance, no battles, just endless music, bad decisions, and an entire room willing to call him Your Majesty if the drinks are half price. History may have erased his titles, but it couldn't erase the vibe. You stir the ice and your second door was at third. Waterloo wallbanger, and think about Betsy. Her name lingers like ghost perfume in the air of this club. Even though no one dancing to Chic in the corner has the faintest clue who she was, there's something both funny and achingly romantic about that. A woman once banned from an empire, now remembered by a drink with questionable citrus liqueur ratios. The DJ changes tracks. A funky bass line kicks in. Charles the bartender walks back over, swiping at his epaulets with a cocktail napkin. "You want to know the real reason I opened this place?" he asks, leaning in conspiratorially, because I think they all got cheated. Jérôme, Betsy, Beau, all of them. People remember Napoleon and his horses and his hand-in-jacket poses, but they forget the side stories, the soft ones, the ones that didn't win wars. You nod slowly, mostly because it's hard not to when someone's explaining the origins of a disco ball. Monarchy was such sincerity. By the time we hit the mid-20th century, the American Bonapartes have faded into polite obscurity. The Patterson wealth, thanks to smart real estate and sugar investments, carries them through. But the name, while still an eyebrow asserted, starts to sound more like trivia than legacy. You'd see a Bonaparte listed on a college alumni board, or at a museum fundraiser, but they'd be less likely to wear medals or demand royal protocol at family reunions. Still, Every few decades, someone tries to bring back the sparkle. And that brings us to the New Jersey chapter, the truly baffling final act in this family's long, sequined opera. Charles, our bartender, club owner, faux prince, was born sometime in the early 1950s, or maybe late 40s. Dates get fuzzy when you ask him directly. What's clear is that he grew up surrounded by dusty portraits, moth-eaten coats of arms, and a grandmother who kept telling him, "We are descended from greatness, Charles. Greatness. So eat your greens." As a teen, he developed an intense fascination with two things: French history and disco. "I blame a field trip to the Louvre and Saturday Night Fever," he says. "Changed my life," I realized. Why not both? But Charles majored in hospitality, sort of. He took a few community college courses, read a lot of biographies, and convinced himself that the world was ready for a historically themed nightlife experience. "You have medieval times with turkey legs," he explains. "So why not Napoleonic funk with cocktails?" He saved up. Got a loan. And in 1976, with exactly 3 backers, one of whom thought it was going to be a bistro, he opened Club Bonaparte in Bergen County, New Jersey. The grand opening featured a brass band in faux military garb, a ribbon cutting, with a plastic saber, and a dance floor that had been painstakingly shellacked to resemble the floor plan of Versailles. Unfortunately, no one really noticed this detail after the first spilled daiquiri. The theme was unmistakable: chandeliers. Red velvet, cheap busts of Napoleon perched atop jukeboxes. Each bathroom stall was labeled either Emperor or Empress. There was a VIP section called the Continental System, but no one could quite explain the joke. The menu was a mix of French hors d'oeuvres and American bar snacks, all renamed to sound vaguely regal. Chicken fingers became Bonaparte batons. Onion rings were imperial circles. You get the idea? Historians still argue whether Club Bonaparte was a sincere tribute or a kitsch fever dream, but most lean toward the latter. There was a certain chaotic energy to it all. The waiters wore sashes. The drink menus were bound like treaties. And every Friday night, Charles would give a toast to his great uncle. The emperor himself, while standing on a small platform under a plaster eagle. You ask him if people bought into the act. Some did. He shrugs. Others just came for the fog machine and dollar shots. I wasn't picky. I wanted people to feel like they were part of something mythic, even if it smelled like spilled amaretto. There's something oddly touching about the whole thing. Sure, Club Bonaparte wasn't exactly Studio 54, but it was a dream. A weird, over-decorated, barely profitable dream. Charles ran it like a captain piloting a glittery ship through stormy financial seas. There were weeks with no customers. Then a small spike when a local paper ran a piece titled "The Last Bonaparte of Bergen County." It came with a black and white photo of Charles in a Napoleon costume. One booed up on a speaker, gazing into the distance like he'd just discovered New Jersey. He saved every copy, of course. This was still New Jersey in the late 70s. Fads came and went. Disco got old. People got tired of themed cocktails and joke-sized breadsticks. By 1981, Club Bonaparte was losing money fast. But Charles didn't give up. Not then. He added karaoke. Switched to synth-pop on Thursdays. Hired a mime once. Regretted that immediately. He even tried to rebrand slightly the Bonaparte Lounge with a new slogan. Asterisk where royalty still parties. It didn't help. But he held on. Because what else do you do when you're the last man standing in a family that once tried to rule half the planet? You raise a toast. You keep the lights on. You dance. The fog machine sputters once, theatrically. Then resumes belching scented vapor that smells faintly of vanilla and electrical risk. You're pretty sure it's not supposed to wheeze like that, but Charles insists it's part of the ambience. You lean on the sticky bar top, trying to visualize Jérôme Bonaparte surveying his glittering kingdom of Westphalia, which, if we're honest, was barely a kingdom, and more like a decorative holding pen for Napoleonic ambitions. Let's talk about that kingdom for a moment. In 1807. After steamrolling through half of Europe and throwing crowns around like Marty, grass beads, Napoleon creates the Kingdom of Westphalia and plops his brother Jérôme on the throne. It's basically a mashup of German states stitched together with French military string and good intentions. Its capital, Kassel, becomes the center of operations for Jérôme. shall we say, unique approach to governance. From the moment Jérôme arrives, he treats Westphalia less like a country and more like an extended masquerade ball. Royal court costumes are upgraded, dinner menus resemble theatrical set lists, and budgets are less balanced and more balancing precariously. On a velvet chaise lounge, his motto might as well have been, "Let them eat PT," preferably on horseback and under fireworks. Historians still argue whether Jérôme's reign was a well-meaning farce or a tragicomic accident. On paper, he enacted some progressive reforms. He banned torture, introduced the Napoleonic Code, and, in a surprisingly coherent move, abolished feudal obligations. Not bad for someone whose favorite pastime was allegedly ordering entire wardrobes of uniforms he'd only wear once. But for every enlightened policy, there were two disastrous decisions. Jérôme staffed his court with friends and flatterers, few of whom had ever managed more than a supper club. He once threw a royal gala, where the centerpiece was a swan-shaped ice sculpture that melted and short-circuited the orchestra's harpsichord. These are not the marks of stable governance. The finances were even more unstable. Westphalia was constantly in debt, much of it due to Jérôme's fondness for luxury imports and elaborate festivals. Imagine trying to build infrastructure when your king is more interested in designing themed dinnerware. There's a legend unconfirmed but widely repeated that he once asked for a royal train service despite trains not existing yet. He may have just meant a really long carriage. Or a metaphor, no one is sure. You'd think Napoleon would be furious, and he was eventually. But at first he seemed charmed, even indulgent. Jérôme was his baby brother, after all. He didn't expect him to be a brilliant statesman, just to not burn the kingdom down in a week. Which, to Jérôme's credit, technically didn't. It took at least 2 years. There was a brief military campaign in 1809 where Jérôme was expected to lead troops. He famously lost his way trying to find the enemy, missed the actual battle, and arrived just in time to take a flattering portrait in uniform beside the scorched campfire remains. It was peak Jérôme, not quite helpful, but always stylishly late. Back at Club Bonaparte, Charles chuckles. "You know we had a kingdom night once," he says, pouring a drink with too much vermouth and not enough shame. Tried to recreate one of those castle banquets. He had fondue, a harpist, and one guy dressed as a tax collector. It was not well received. You can imagine it. The slightly baffled patrons eating cheese on a stick while a woman in a powdered wig sings 18th century German ballads to a room lit by blacklight. The kind of evening where everyone pretends. It's ironic, but secretly wonders if they're being indoctrinated into something historic and cult-adjacent. Charles leans in, lowering his voice. Want to hear the best part? Wrote a fake constitution. For the club, printed it on parchment. It guaranteed the right to boogie. Irrespective of social class, you snort laugh into your drink. And honestly, it fits. Jérôme says whole Westphalian experiment was a glittering contradiction, progressive. Laws stitched into an empire of showbiz governance. He wanted to be modern, but adored the symbols of old royalty. He talked about liberty while bankrupting. Villages to buy imported wine. He may not have known what he was doing, but he made sure it looked fabulous while falling apart. Eventually, reality caught up. By 1813, Napoleon's power was unraveling, and Westphalia became more liability than legacy. Jérôme, never one for heroic last stands, fled Cosel before the Prussian troops arrived. He left behind hastily packed trunks, empty wine cellars, and a court that disbanded like an underfunded theater troupe after closing night, and then like a disco ball. Turned off mid-spin, Westphalia was gone. Jérôme tried to reinvent himself. As a roving gentleman, he kept the titles, the manners, the uniforms. He showed up at royal gatherings as the guy with a past and no current address. He was still charming, still impeccably dressed, still somehow both a joke and a survivor club. Bonaparte feels like the spiritual sequel to Westphalia. Not a nation, but a micro-state of mood lighting and fantasy. A place where legacy is preserved in cocktails, and every Thursday night. People with day jobs and dance shoes declare themselves royalty. Charles raises a glass to his great-great-uncle, the King of Westphalia. He did his best, he says, solemnly, even if his best involved gold-plated curtains and a theater troupe called the Imperial Nymphs. You clink glasses, somewhere deep in the smoky corners of your brain. You swear you hear distant accordion music and the soft rustle of satin capes. You watch Charles shuffle across the dance floor to adjust the lighting again. One of the bulbs has started pulsing erratically, giving off the unsettling vibe of a haunted emergency exit. He gives it a gentle smack with a bar menu. The pulse slows. The vibe returns. This is his kingdom now. Like Jérôme's Westphalia, it's half dream, half decaying infrastructure. But let's not leave Kassel too fast. Because if there's one thing the Kingdom of Westphalia deserves, it's a closer look at the chaos, those glorious, absurd details that never make the history books but absolutely should. For instance, Jérôme's official palace staff included 6 royal hairdressers for dancing instructors and a parrot that allegedly could whistle La Marseillaise. His dinner parties were legendary, mostly for their length. Guests were often trapped for hours while each course was introduced, with an overly dramatic flourish, sometimes involving velvet curtains and a trumpet. It's said that once, during dessert, an entire cake was unveiled by 2 footmen in matching tunics while a violinist played a solo called Sugar for His Majesty. And then there was the lawmaking. The Napoleonic Code was a civil law triumph. Uniform, rational, modern at least for its time. Napoleon wanted it spread across all of Europe, and Jérôme's Westphalia was the test kitchen. Unfortunately, Jérôme approached implementation like a man assembling IKEA furniture after several glasses of cognac. He got the gist, but the details wobbled. For one, French was the administrative language, but very few people in Westphalia spoke fluent French. Legal proceedings took twice as long because interpreters had to be hired, trained, and frequently re-explained the difference between land tax and mandatory champagne fund. He also tried to model his court on the splendor of Versailles without realizing that Versailles had been bankrupt too. The people of Westphalia, many of whom were recovering from years of war and conscription, were especially thrilled about paying for Jérôme's Swan Pond renovation. Historians still argue whether Jérôme's failures were due to genuine incompetence or simply being hopelessly out of touch. Some say he was just a spoiled younger brother playing dress-up with real consequences. Others argue he had reformist instincts but lacked the attention span to see anything through unless it involved curtains or epaulets. Back in the club, Charles nods along as you share these thoughts. You know, he says, we had a toga night once. It's not historically accurate. I know, but it felt on brand. Everyone wore bed sheets. I played the role of the Imperial Senate and served drinks with a ladle. We got a cease and desist letter from an actual Italian restaurant with a similar theme. You try not to choke on your drink, but it raises a point. What happens when the trappings of empire become costume? When legitimacy blurs with theatrics? Westphalia was built as an experimental laboratory for Napoleonic ambition. But instead of producing stable governance, it became a real-life opera buffa, dramatic, ornate, and structurally unsound. Still, there were moments of unintended brilliance. Jérôme's court was one of the first in Germany to adopt metric weights and measures. He encouraged religious tolerance, even flirted with the idea of Jewish emancipation, though he left most of the heavy lifting to local administrators who were slightly less distracted by ballroom rehearsals. But ultimately, none of it was sustainable by 1813. With the Sixth Coalition advancing and Napoleon losing his grip, Westphalia crumbled like a poorly made soufflé. Jérôme fled Kassel under the cover of night. The treasury was empty. Fountains had stopped. The parrot reportedly refused to sing. Jérôme would never rule again. He wandered for a while, oddly. Austria, various borrowed villas. His wife, Katharina, stayed loyal. She stuck with him through the fall, the exile, and the increasingly eccentric behavior. She even followed him into obscurity when they settled in Trieste under Austrian surveillance. Imagine going from glittering court balls to buying your own groceries and explaining to nosy neighbors why your husband insists on being called sire during breakfast. Eventually, Jérôme would return to France under Napoleon III, the nephew of the original Napoleon, who offered him a ceremonial role. He served as governor of Les Invalides, a military complex in Paris, which must have felt like assigning Liberace to a military retirement home. He posed for portraits. He gave speeches. He wore medals. Mostly he remembered when he died in 1860. He was buried with honors, in full uniform, surrounded by symbols of an empire long gone. He had lived a life more theatrical than most operas, and left behind a trail of debts, love letters, and at least one decorative harpsichord engraved with his initials. Charles lights a small candle near the bar. For him, he says softly, for Jérôme, patron saint of misguided ambition and fabulous outfits. The candle flickers gently, illuminating a dusty portrait of a young man in military garb, smirking like he just got away with something expensive. You raise your glass. In silent agreement. It's not often that failed monarchs get disco tributes, but maybe they should. The candle casts a gentle glow that bounces off the mirrored bar, warping Jérôme's painted smirk into a mischievous little wink. Whether by artistry or accident, the portrait almost looks alive, as if he's about to hop off the wall and order an overcomplicated cocktail. The music shifts into a slower groove, something with heavy bass and whispered vocals. Charles takes a seat beside you at the bar, stretching his back with the weary grace of a man who has personally installed every bulb in the ceiling. You know, he says, historians give Jérôme a lot of grief, but I think he knew exactly what he was doing. You arch an eyebrow. I mean, he continues, not politically, obviously. That part was a disaster. But socially, culturally, he knew how to make an entrance and an exit. This is where the story takes its subtle turn from what Jérôme did to how he was remembered. Because once the curtain fell on his kingdom and he'd aged out of his uniform phase, he did something rather unexpected. He became likable, not as a king, but as a man in his later years. Jérôme stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. No more battlefield bluffs or dramatic proclamations. Just quiet dinners, memoir writing, and nostalgic sighs. He took long walks. He hosted modest salons. He told stories that started with "back when I was king" and ended with polite laughter and a refill of port. There's something universally disarming about failed grandeur. A man who once ruled and now folds napkins himself. That's endearing, even comforting. Like discovering your history professor once played bass in a ska band. You start to see the whole human arc. Historians still argue whether Jérôme's post-exile humility was genuine or performative. Some say he grew wise with age. Others think he simply ran out of velvet. Either way, it worked. His reputation softened. People stopped seeing him as a punchline and started seeing him as part of a larger, richer tale, one of loyalty, loss, and absurd legacy. And the legacy did endure, not through war or policy, but through family. That son, Botha, American Bonaparte, became a respected industrialist and a walking footnote. His children married well. His grandchildren became politicians, scholars, and lawyers. The bloodline stayed visible, if diluted. The name Bonaparte still got whispered at fancy dinners, though increasingly in the form of, "Oh, those Bonapartes." Charles grins. There's a rumor my great-uncle once tried to buy Napoleon's original campaign bed. He pauses. A flea market in Ohio, you blink. It was mislabeled as folding military cot. He couldn't afford it. The mix of reverence and mild absurdity somehow feels perfect, because the Bonapartes, especially the American ones, always straddled that fine line between prestige and punchline. Too grand to be forgotten, too chaotic to be truly honored. Charles rises and walks you over to a small glass case mounted on the wall. Inside is a faded letter, framed lovingly, written in spidery cursive. "That's from Betsy," he says, voice low. To Beau, she signed it with just a B, as if they both knew what that meant. You lean closer. The ink is faint, but the words are visible. "Remember who you are, my dear. Not because the world owes you anything, but because your name came with a story, and stories must be carried like candlesticks in the wind. A little over the top. Absolutely, but also kind of beautiful. The thing is, you start to realize the Bonapartes didn't fail because they were unworthy. They failed because they were human. and nothing erodes human plans faster than time, public opinion, and poor accounting. And yet they tried. They danced. They built things. They married the wrong people and threw the right parties. They made a scene. Sometimes the scene involved swans, sometimes wigs, sometimes both. And they endured, not in palaces or museums, but in nightclubs and newspaper. Articles and dusty letters and whispered barroom trivia. Club Bonaparte may not be Versailles, but its walls hold stories. Stories about legacy, ambition, and the quiet. Funny ways we all try to matter. Charles slaps a dusty jukebox, which coughs once and lights up reluctantly. "This thing," he says proudly, "only plays French disco." You'd be amazed how specific. That genre is, you wouldn't, not anymore. Because by now, this club makes sense. Chandeliers, the uniforms, the cocktail names. It's not parody. It's not even homage. It's rescue. Charles has built a sanctuary for lost legacies. Where history isn't corrected, it's celebrated. It's with sequins. You step back and let the music wash over you. Maybe Jérôme never deserved a throne, but he absolutely deserved a theme night. You're halfway through a surprisingly well-balanced imperial mule when Charles tells you the real reason the club exists. "It wasn't just for me," he says, flipping a cocktail napkin like it's a dramatic cape. "It was for them. Them. In this case, being his ancestors. Not just the ones with thrones and powdered wigs, but the American branch. The ones who stayed behind. The ones who didn't get annulled or dethroned, just slowly, gently, forgotten. Most people think legacy means monuments," Charles muses. "But sometimes it's just a name on a mailbox, or a stack of letters in a drawer nobody opens anymore." That brings us to the American Bonapartes, the post-Betsy generation. Because while Europe was busy rearranging its borders and restoring old monarchies, Betsy's son Beau was growing up in a house full of echoes. He inherited his mother's wit and his father's cheekbones, but not much else. France never acknowledged him. Napoleon made sure of that. Jérôme's new royal family was sanitized of American errors. Betsy wasn't even a footnote in the official histories. But Beau didn't fade away. He became a successful businessman import-export. Land holdings, railroads, the usual Gilded Age toolkit. He spoke fluent French and fluent sarcasm. He wore tailored suits and insisted on calling his servants by name. He married Susan May Williams, a rich Baltimore heiress, and ensured the family's place among America's genteel elite. Their children were raised with the dignity of American wealth and the implied nobility of European blood. They knew who they were, and more importantly, they knew who they weren't. Official Bonapartes. That title, like the throne of Westphalia, was always just out of reach. Historians still argue whether the American Bonapartes wanted recognition from France, or just enjoyed the mystique. There's no evidence they ever formally petitioned Napoleon III, but there are plenty of dinner party accounts where one or another would casually mention. Our European cousins between spoonfuls of bisque. Then comes Charles Joseph Bonaparte Beau's grandson, a man who rejected the fluff and leaned hard into public service. In the early 1900s, Charles served as Secretary of the Navy and then Attorney General under Teddy Roosevelt. He was serious, bookish, often photographed looking like he just corrected someone's Latin, and he founded the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI. Which means, yes, that America's most famous law enforcement agency was started by a Bonaparte, though one who probably would have fainted at the sight of this nightclub's drink menu. Charles, the nightclub owner, is quick to remind you that his name is also Charles. It's not a coincidence, he says. We're not the kind of family that wastes a perfectly good name. But by the mid-20th century, the family tree begins to thin. The name Bonaparte appears. Less and less in society pages, and more in quiet obituaries. A few cousins go into law. One opens a dry cleaning business. A distant relative becomes a weatherman in Ohio. The glamour fades. The myth settles into dormancy. That's when Charles gets the idea. He's in his 20s, flipping through an old shoebox of yellowed photos and brittle letters. There's one of Betsy in a shawl, staring at the camera like she dares you to question her taste in husbands. Another of Beau in a top hat, looking vaguely like he's about to buy a railway. and one of Jérôme, of course, copied from a painting gilded. Moody, heroic, a man who conquered absolutely nothing but still managed to be memorable. Charles looks at the shoebox, then at the fading state of his local disco scene, and thinks, why not both? He tells you this while adjusting the lights for Napoleonic Nostalgia Night, a weekly event that involves French pop, mildly threatening cheese platters, and one guy who always insists on wearing a sash. No one knows who invited him. Number one minds, I figured. Charles shrugs. If I can't inherit a crown, I'll just build one. One disco tile at a time. And he kind of did. Club Bonaparte became a time capsule and a tribute. Not just to European drama, but to American eccentricity. To those who dreamed a little too big and dressed a little too loud. To a family that started with cannon fire and ended with karaoke. You take a slow walk through the club now, seeing it with new eyes. The portraits aren't kitsch, they're anchors. The drink names aren't jokes. They're breadcrumbs. Detail, from the chandeliers to the laminated menus, is part of a very peculiar scrapbook. A living museum. Duh. One where admission costs $10 and comes with a complimentary shot of Elba espresso. At the back of the club, there's a velvet curtain. Covering a narrow hallway, Charles opens it for you. This, he whispers, is the Napoleonic Lounge. It's quiet, dimly lit, no music. Just a long red couch, a bookshelf of biographies, and a small cabinet of memorabilia, a coin from Westphalia, a replica of Jérôme's military sash, and a pair of gloves supposedly worn by Betsy at a new. York ball? This room's not for partying, Charles says. It's for remembering. You sit for a moment. The silence is soft, reverent. And for the first time all night, the story doesn't feel like a farce. It feels like a legacy, Dusty. Dazzling and still dancing. You step out of the Napoleonic Lounge, a little buzzed, a little emotional, and a lot unsure if you imagined the whole glove in a Glasgow thing. Back in the main room, the vibe has shifted again. The DJ, who looks vaguely like someone who might also teach community college history, has segued into a funk remix of La Vie en Rose. It shouldn't work, but somehow it does. Charles is nowhere to be seen for the moment. You wander toward the coat check, which has been repurposed as a photo booth. There's a basket of props, plastic sabers, tricorn hats, a cardboard crown. Labeled King of the Dance Floor? Someone stumbles out, wearing a powdered wig over a Bon Jovi t-shirt. You don't ask questions. You're starting to understand something crucial. This isn't just a story about the Bonapartes. It's a story about New Jersey in the 1970s. And if you're going to understand why someone would open a nightclub with imperial branding, you have to understand the very particular cocktail that was 1970s Jersey nightlife equal parts ambition. Glitter and the sheer refusal to admit defeat. It was a wild time. The post-industrial economy was wobbling, the suburbs were blooming, and everyone was desperately trying to feel important. Enter the disco era now. New York had Studio 54. LA had the Roxy. But New Jersey had 1,000 clubs carved into old diners, carpeted bowling alleys, and buildings that had once hosted union meetings and now just hosted bad decisions. Historians still argue whether Jersey's disco scene was a cultural movement or a prolonged cry for help. Either way, it was loud. Neon signs, velvet ropes, DJs who treated their crates of vinyl like sacred relics. The floors were sticky, the bathrooms terrifying, and the outfits lured. The outfits defied both weather and dignity. Club Bonaparte arrived right in the thick of it. Charles picked Bergen County for a reason. It was close enough to New York to catch the overflow crowd, but far enough that people wouldn't blink at weird themes or odd furniture choices. Real estate was cheapish, and the bones of the old building he bought had just enough mystery to suggest former glitz. The previous owner had run a moderately successful steakhouse/wingers lounge. Charles decided to leave the mirrored ceiling intact. He gutted the rest. Installed velvet drapes, rented chandeliers from a theater, supply house in Newark, and spent 2 weeks hand-stenciling CB monograms onto every bar stool. He repurposed an old cigarette machine into a novelty fortune teller that spit out quotes from Napoleon in place of horoscopes. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake was a crowd favor test, especially on dates. Opening night, a full house, mostly curious locals, a few drunk French majors. One man in a complete hussar uniform who no one ever saw again. The fog machine broke halfway through, and a power surge knocked out the lights, leaving the crowd to finish there. Drinks and candlelight. Charles spun it as authentic ambience. The reviews were mixed but generous. The club thrived briefly. Word spread. It's not far, but enough. People came to dance, to laugh, to take pictures under the replica arc, to triomphe, installed by the bathroom hallway. There was something so earnest about it all. So deeply uncool that it wrapped back around to being charming. It even caught the attention of a local paper, which ran a short piece titled "Waterloo and White Polyester. Meet the Prince of Paramus." The article was kind but bemused, like someone writing about a man who believes he's raising unicorns but is actually breeding slightly aggressive goats. Charles framed the article and hung it above the coat rack. He leaned into the theme harder. Introduced Emperor's Hour from 7 to 8, where drinks were half price, and anyone who could quote a Napoleonic maxim got a free breadstick. Breadstick diplomacy was briefly trending among the regulars, though only inside the club. Then came the expansion idea. Charles wanted to open a sister venue, Josephine's, just down the road. It would be softer, more romantic, more pastel, a place for slower dances, and historically inaccurate absinthe cocktails. He even started scouting locations, but the disco scene was already cracking. By 1980, people were moving on. Funk gave way to synthpop. Velvet started to feel a little sad. The regulars began to thin. The once gilded decor started to peel at the edges. A light bulb in the Bonaparte sign blew out and stayed that way for 3 weeks. The joke was that the place had been de-Napoleonized. Charles tried to pivoted live jazz nights, started a trivia series so you think you know Corsica, even booked a magician who did close-up sleight of hand with miniature French flags. But the spark was fading. And yet, the club didn't close. It refused. Just like Jérôme had refused to fade away quietly. Just like Betsy had refused to disappear from Baltimore society. Just like Beau had refused to accept obscurity without at least one polite duel and a signature ascot, Charles kept it alive. Barely. Because this wasn't just a business. It was a mausoleum with a dance floor. It was the last waltz of a family that refused to be forgotten. And as you step back out onto the floor, it's where 3 dedicated souls are grooving to a remix of Voulez Vous. You realize something. Maybe that's enough. Maybe legacy doesn't have to shine. Maybe sometimes it just needs to blink in neon. You return to your booth, the cracked vinyl sighing under you like an old friend with sore knees. Charles reappears, balancing a tray with 2 drinks, one labeled the Corsican Colada, the other in a coupe glass etched with a tiny imperial eagle. He sets them down like offerings to a sleepy god and sits across from you with the gravity of a man about to tell you something important. "I always knew this wasn't going to make money," he says plainly. "Not really." You pause. Mid-sip, the colada is oddly spicy. Charles shrugs. It was never about the money. It was about making it real. That's when you understand. The club, it's weird, wonderful, fire, code questionable. Corners isn't just a tribute. It's a recreation, a resurrection, the ghost of a legacy given walls, lights, and a fog machine. It's like cosplay, but with paperwork and plumbing issues. In this section of the story, the dream of Club Bonaparte's, where the idea goes full sparkle. The drinks are themed. The walls are lined with faux oil paintings printed at Kinko's. There's a designated selfie spot called the Battle of Selfie Lou. The chandelier above the dance floor is affectionately called the Crown Jewel. The one of its crystals fell off during a particularly enthusiastic rendition of Boogie Wonderland. Historians still argue whether themed entertainment is kitsch or cultural preservation. Charles doesn't care. He believes in vibes over verdicts. You start to notice more of the club's strange features. The booths are each named after Bonaparte siblings. The one you're sitting in, Lucien, across from you, Elisa. A small plaque above the jukebox reads, "He who controls the O-chord controls the empire." The bar has its own menu of imperial elixirs. Among them, the Josephine, dry vermouth, rose water, 3 apologies, the Waterloo Wallbanger, Galliano, orange juice, defeat. The bourbon restoration, just straight-up bourbon, served with ironic detachment. There's a recurring event every Thursday, regime change night. Half-price drinks, if you come dressed as a monarch who was deposed. One memorable guest came as Richard Nixon holding a model guillotine. He was asked to leave after demanding a DJ. Set you wonder aloud how the locals reacted to all this when it first opened. Charles chuckles. Most of them thought I was a lunatic. Or, worse, a theater major. But over time, Club Bonaparte carved out a niche, became the kind of place you went when you didn't fit anywhere else. The misfits, the night owls, the ones who preferred history with their hangovers. Charles attracted a crowd not with exclusivity, but with acceptance. You didn't have to know who Jérôme Bonaparte was. You just had to be willing to dance beneath his plaster bust. And then there were the regulars. There was Mona, who dressed like Josephine every Friday and claimed to have once dated a descendant of the Duke of Wellington. Her purse contained both lavender perfume and a laminated poem. Waterloo Dan, who had a different Napoleon joke for every night, none of which landed. Joey V, a Vietnam vet turned harmonica enthusiast, who once serenaded the entire club with law. Marseillaise and blues scale kind of worked. The club became home for them. Not just a place to drink or dance, but a soft-lit sanctuary for people who liked their history weird and their whiskey cheap. One night, a grad student wrote an article about the club for their dissertation. The title? Epaulets and Empathy, Post-Imperial Identity in Suburban Recreational Spaces. Charles framed it. The professor who reviewed the paper gave it a B+, noting excellent ethnography, questionable footnotes, some glitter residue on the submission. But more than the jokes, the drinks, or the photos of shirtless DJs in Napoleonic bicorns, there was something deeper. Club Bonaparte gave people permission to be extra. To walk into a crumbling dance hall in Paramus and say, "Tonight, I am royalty." Maybe just for a song, maybe just long enough to forget the water damage in the ceiling. Charles raises his glass to you, to the absurd, he says, which is often the most honest thing we have. And you clink because he's right. In a world that moves fast and forgets quickly, sometimes the most radical act is to remember loudly. Awkwardly, with a rhinestone cape and a playlist full of Donna Summer. The drinks have blurred the edges of your vision just enough to make the chandelier look regal rather than unstable. You're feeling loose, warm, and deeply invested in whether the jukebox is going to make it through this next track without. A small electrical fire, and that's when you notice the carpeting. Oh, the carpeting. It's burgundy with gold fleur-de-lis. It's faded in high-traffic areas and probably older than most of the light bulbs. It smells faintly of rum, hairspray, and something you might generously describe as vintage upholstery musk. It is simultaneously regal and tragic. A metaphor in textile form, imported from Delaware, Charles says proudly, watching your eyes trace the faded patterns, supposed to resemble Versailles. Looks more like a Renault casino floor, but hey, intentions. You chuckle. Gaz! That's really the Club Bonaparte brand. Maximalist intentions. Mid-tier materials, and a whole lot of historical audacity. You take another look around. Above the bar, there's a badly gold-leafed sign that reads, "L'Empire Cest Nous, we are the Empire." The U in Nous is slightly crooked. You decide not to mention it. The furniture is equally committed to the cause. Bar stools, shaped like mini thrones, sconces made from repurposed brass instruments. It's an occasional faint wheeze from the HVAC system that sounds vaguely like someone sighing in French. The aesthetic is somewhere between Marie Antoinette's Pinterest board and a very enthusiastic high school theater set. But that's what makes it sing. There's no halfway here. Everything is trying so hard, and somehow that effort becomes endearing. In a world full of sleek, soulless cocktail lounges, Club Bonaparte is gloriously tacky. I'm proud of it. Historians still argue whether style or substance has more staying power. Club Bonaparte answers that debate with a resounding, what if substance wore style like a glittering cape and dared you to say something about it? You notice the bar menu is printed on faux parchment? The appetizer section is titled petites? Bataille is little battles, which includes garlic knots, chicken sauté, and a suspiciously labeled item called Corsican flatbread. When you ask what's Corsican about it, Charles shrugs and says, I think we put rosemary on it once. Then there's the decor. Paintings of Napoleon, some famous, some obviously commissioned by local artists with varying degrees of enthusiasm line. The walls. There's a life-size cardboard cutout of Josephine, whose smile has faded into something halfway between amused and please rescue me. At one point, you pass a statue of a Roman emperor, which Charles admits he'd bought by accident. Wrong era, he says, but it gives the place gravitas. The best part? The bathrooms. Yes, we need to talk about the bathrooms. The doors are labeled Toilette de l'Empereur and Salle de la Reine. Inside, it's all gold-trimmed mirrors, faux marble counters, and signs that say things like conquer hygiene and clean hands, clean empire. Someone has taped a laminated quote to the hand dryer. A throne is only as strong as its plumbing. Not Napoleon, probably. But you appreciate the effort, and people love it. Or at least, they learn to love it. Club Bonaparte has the kind of charm that grows on you like velvet mold. At first, you come for the novelty. Then, for the drinks. Then, because nowhere else in town makes you feel like a character in an unfilmed Wes Anderson. War drama set in 1812 and soundtracked by ABBA. It becomes a habit, a refuge, and eventually, for some, becomes home. There's something about places like this anachronistic, strange, defiantly specific, that draws people who don't quite fit anywhere else. The too loud, the too soft, the history nerds, the dreamers, the backup dancers to their own imagined revolutions. Club Bonaparte doesn't care who you are, as long as you respect the dance floor and don't spill your cocktail on the epaulets and the locals. Well, they adjusted. At first, the club was a curiosity, then a joke, then a staple. People would come in on a dare and end up staying for years. You'd hear things like, it's weird, but it grows on you. My aunt met her third husband here. They do surprisingly good mozzarella sticks. The fog machine is haunted, but in a fun way. Charles started recognizing generations of patrons, kids of regulars, cousins of ex-bartenders, people who brought their parents for Bastille Day karaoke. Once, an entire bridal party showed up in revolutionary garb and insisted on being referred to as the People's Court. You don't get that kind of loyalty from minimalism. It's the detail, the over-the-topness, the unapologetic theatricality. Of it all, it's what made Jérôme charming, even in exile, and what made Betsy unforgettable, even after being erased. What made Beau dignified, even without a throne. Club Bonaparte doesn't mock history. It lets it live, even if it's a little tipsy. The disco ball spins overhead, catching the light in little bursts like a battlefield of sequins frozen mid-charge. You watch it turn and think wearily about cannon fire, about how history and nightlife both rely on good timing, dramatic flair, and just the right amount of smoke. It's getting later now. The crowd has thickened. Music's louder. The drink's a little stronger. But the energy has shifted from novelty to something resembling sincerity. The people here aren't just humoring the theme anymore. They're part of it. There's a man in a velvet waistcoat leaning against the bar, speaking in what might be a French accent or just a very committed imitation. A woman at the far end of the dance floor is wearing a sash that says Minister of Groove. Two teenagers in sparkly capes keep challenging each other to duels with glow sticks. None of this is ironic. It's just the vibe, and then you meet the regulars. Not just the eccentrics and trivia night champions, but the lifers, the ones who've been coming since day one, ones with stories. Take Marvin and Edie. He's in a tan leisure suit with a plastic medal that says Order of the Night. She's got a tiara made of Christmas tinsel, and the kind of confident eyeliner that only comes from decades of practice. They met at Club Bonaparte in 1978 during Continental Drift Night, a poorly conceived evening meant to combine history and geology. It did not go well, but the music was great, Edie says, swirling a drink called the Gilded Lily. And he asked me to dance, in front of everyone. It's like I was a duchess. They've been married for 40 years. Still come here every Thursday? Then there's Big Sal. Nobody knows his real name. He's part bartender, part bouncer, part unofficial historian. Can recite the club's drink menu from memory and explain the actual Treaty of Tilsit in under 2 minutes. He's got a tattoo of Napoleon on one arm and a frog wearing a crown on the other. Symbolic, he says. Or maybe just weird, you decide. He tells you about a night in '81 when the power went out mid-dance. Total blackout. Someone started humming Bolero, and within minutes, the whole club was slow dancing in the dark. No lights, no music, just the shared rhythm and a lot of trusting footsteps. That, he says, was when I knew this place mattered. Historians still argue whether nostalgia distorts more than it preserves. But here, in this fog-hazed temple of kitsch, the past doesn't feel distant or untouchable. It feels interactive, participatory, like a costume you try on not to mock, but to remember how it might have felt to wear it. The club had its high points. At one point, Charles managed to book a minor celebrity, someone who once played a general in a late-night historical drama, to host a Bastille Day bash. They ran out of champagne in 45 minutes. Someone tried to roast a chicken over the fog machine, and the celebrity left early after being asked to DJ. Then came the Jersey Magazine feature, a glossy 4-page spread, the Bonaparte of Bergen County. Charles in full regalia, posing like a lost Habsburg, flanked by wine bottles and a woman in a plastic crown, who did not remember agreeing to the photo. The article brought a new wave of visitors, curious, ironic, vaguely mocking. What a few of them stayed. Something about the place dug in under their skin, because while most clubs are designed to make you forget your life for a few hours, Club Bonaparte makes you feel like you're entering another one. A parallel timeline, slower, sillier, somehow sweeter version of reality where everyone has a title, every toast has a footnote, and nobody gets judged for knowing too much about 19th century textile trade routes. You lean against the bar and ask Charles if he ever considered changing the theme. You know, you suggest, go full modern, just start fresh. He stares at you like you just suggested selling the Mona Lisa to pay for snack vending machines. Change it? He says this is the fresh. And maybe he's right, because while the decor may be dated and the plumbing occasionally groans like a wounded accordion, the idea behind Club Bonaparte is evergreen. Take history, make it human. Make it wearable, make it dance. There's a toast every midnight. It's always the same. To the fallen, Charles declares, raising his glass. And to those who got back up in style, the whole club joins in. Not everyone knows what they're cheering, but they cheer anyway. It's a ritual. Pageant. A little silly, a little sacred. You lift your glass too, because even if you've never memorized Napoleon's birth date, or followed his siblings' tumultuous lives, or named a cat after the Duke of Wellington, Edie Haas's name is Boots. You understand the deeper rhythm of this place. We all want to be remembered, even if just for dancing well on a Thursday. As the clock inches toward midnight and the bass rattles the windows in that gentle, persistent way only polyesteria speakers can manage, the crowd starts to lean into the night's theme, velvet ropes and velvet revolutions. You hadn't even realized there was a theme tonight until someone handed you a pamphlet printed in faux parchment titled Tonight's Suggested Revolts, complete with outfit inspiration and quotes from revolutionary figures, some of them real, some of them suspiciously borrowed from song lyrics. You're handed a sash that says Minister of Misrule. It sparkles. You wear it immediately. This is how Club Bonaparte does it, with just enough organization to suggest purpose, and just enough chaos to suggest this could absolutely collapse into interpretive dance at any moment. It's all by design or at least by tradition. Tonight's revolution comes with a cover charge and a cheese plate. The dance floor now pulses with people in sashes, literary jackets, velvet gowns, and what might be a Roman gladiator costume, wrong era, but no one's. Policing. Charles moves through them like a statesman at a particularly funky summit, stopping to pose for photos, adjust a wig here, a 5, a powdered general there. There's even a makeshift throne in the corner, labeled the people's seat. Whoever wins the dance duel of Danton gets to sit there for 10 minutes and choose the next 3 songs. The rules are vague, the enforcement looser, but the joy is very real. Historians still argue whether revolutionary ideals can be domesticated into entertainment. But here at Club Bonaparte, revolution comes with good lighting and a disco additive. The Marseillaise. You spot a woman maybe in her 60s dancing barefoot with absolute abandon. Her sash reads Bastille Babe, just spinning to a remix of something by Boney M, arms wide, eyes closed, mouthing lyrics that might also be a rallying cry. You don't know her, but you know exactly what she feels. Freedom through absurdity, and for a moment, just a moment, you get it. You get why Charles does this. Why people keep coming back. Why Club Bonaparte, failing business, defiant relic. Dream in polyester somehow still works. It's not about France. It's about permission. Permission. To be dramatic, to be weird, to care about things deeply and irrationally and beautifully, to put on a sash and declare, "Tonight I matter." Charles once told a local reporter, "It's not cosplay, it's identity, just temporarily borrowed from people." Who had better tailors? You believe him? Back at the bar, the drink specials are getting even more ambitious. You see a new cocktail called the Sansculotte Spritzer. It's red, frothy, and arrives in a tiny glass boot. Charles explains it's meant to represent the revolutionary fervor of the common man, but with bubbles. You decide not to ask. What's in it? The food specials tonight are equally themed. Robespierre's cheese guillotine, a wheel of brie on a cutting board with a tiny guillotine slicer. Storm the baguette bastion, 3 loaves stacked dramatically like a fortress. With herbed butter cannons, Madame Defarge's deviled eggs, each one topped with a different spicy mystery topping. You try one, contains horseradish and possibly ambition. There's also a trivia round. A wild, chaotic 10-minute blitz led by Sal, who reads questions. With the intensity of a revolutionary tribunal, people shout answers. Someone challenges a point about the Congress of Vienna. Someone else throws a breadstick. It is electric. And in the middle of it all, Charles climbs up on a chair carefully, knees creaking and taps his glass. "Tonight," he declares, "we honor the greatest revolution of all, refusing to be boring in a world that desperately wants you to be." The crowd roars. Is it cheesy? Absolutely. Does it hit? Oh, yes, because when you strip away the glitter, the gimmicks, the historically questionable decor, you're left with something oddly moving. A man trying to keep memory alive, not through textbooks or plaques, but through laughter, spectacle, and stubborn joy. And while the velvet ropes of real history often kept people out, Club Bonaparte flings them open. Tonight, everyone's nobility. Everyone's a revolutionary. Everyone gets their moment on the people's seat. You watch a young couple slow dance under the disco ball. Their outfits are absurd. Their smiles are real. They might not know who. Jérôme Bonaparte was they probably couldn't point to Westphalia on a map. But they're living proof that history doesn't have to be a museum piece. It can be alive, swaying gently, wrapped in velvet. The fog machine sighs, releasing a long, fragrant exhale like it's had a long day at court. You lean against a velvet-draped pillar, probably a repurposed support beam, and sip what may or may not be your third Napoleon complex. It tastes vaguely of cherry cola and regret with a twist of lemon. This is when the cracks in the empire start to show. Club Bonaparte, like every self-respecting monarchy, eventually faces its collapse. Not in one grand coup, but slowly, softly, like a curtain drawn over a party that's lasted just a little too long. The crowds begin to thin. The regulars still Carmarvin and Edie. Sal, the woman with the glitter sash who never remembers her. Tab-Butt, the curious tourist, stops showing up. The feature in Bergen magazine fades from memory. The velvet starts to fray. The drinks get a little weaker. The stereo starts skipping during Voulazou. Charles tries to adapt, introduces. New theme nights. Coup de Tuesdays, which involves surprise karaoke battles. Napoleon's pajama ball pajamas were encouraged. Accuracy was not. Exile Island, a beach-themed night with tiny Elba umbrellas in every drink. Some worked, most didn't. He brought in live music, a one-man accordion act, named Franz, who insisted on calling every set the sound and the fury. He tried a short-lived tapas menu inspired by Napoleonic supply chain logistics, which mostly involved crackers and pickles. The cracks widened. Charles had never run a business before Club Bonaparte. His background was at best adjacent to hospitality. A little community theater, little retail, a brief stint selling novelty wigs from a kiosk at the Paramus Mall. But his real expertise was vision, not management, and managing a nightclub. That's not romance. That's receipts. Ice machines. Broken toilets. Employee scheduling. Insurance. Snow shoveling. Vendor feuds. The royal fantasy leaves no room for inventory checks. Money gets tight. The kitchen staff shrinks to one. Very surly man named Troy, who refers to himself as Minister of Gravy. The drinks are mostly pre-mixed. Signature cocktails lose their flair. The breadstick diplomatic corps menu disappears entirely, replaced by whatever Troy feels like frying. You ask Charles if he ever thought about giving up, he shrugs. Every week, but then someone would show up dressed as Lafayette, and I'd think, okay, one more night. 'Cause that's the strange truth about places like this. They survive on fumes and faith. They don't function, they endure. Because there's always someone who needs that weird little sanctuary. Always someone having the kind of day that only a disco ball and a fake crown can fix. But endurance has a cost. The IRS does not care if your cocktail napkins are shaped like imperial edicts. Creditors do not accept velvet sashes as collateral. And royalty, as Charles learns, cannot negotiate with utility companies when the power bill is 4 months late. Historians still argue whether Club Bonaparte's downfall was due to poor management or cultural obsolescence, likely both. By the mid-1980s, the disco era was long dead. Themed venues were seen as corny, historical kitsch was out, minimalism was in. The new bars had chrome fixtures and cocktails that tasted like sadness in a glass. Charles tried one final rebrand. He called it La Resistance, same building, same decor. Slightly moodier lighting. A noir aesthetic, with trench coats encouraged, and a drink called French Exit. It lasted 3 months. The final weeks of Club Bonaparte are a blur of nostalgia and light bulb failures. It's the ice machine. Gives up completely. The fog machine begins coughing with such mechanical sadness that patrons mistake it for part of the music. Then, one night the bank calls. The building has been sold. The lease is up. There's no time left. Charles gathers the regulars. They plan one final party, the last dance at Tuileries. Formal dress encouraged. Epaulets welcome. Revolution chic optional. You wish you could have been there. Edie brought a cake shaped like Napoleon's hat. Sal read a speech he wrote on the back of a laminated menu. Marvin danced so hard he lost a cufflink and declared it a symbolic act of surrender. Charles wore his full regalia. The blue sash, the gold braided jacket, the boots he never quite broke in. He gave a toast that, according to 3 separate eyewitnesses, made people cry over vodka cranberries, and then, just after midnight, he turned off the lights. Not all at once. One switch at a time, the music faded. The disco ball slowed. The last. Fog drifted across the floor like the ghost of an empire that never quite was but really. Almost should have been. Club Bonaparte was closed, but not forgotten. Not by the people who danced there. Not by the people who loved there. Not by the ones who felt seen for the first time in a velvet booth beside a jukebox that only played French disco, and not by Charles. Because Charles isn't the kind of man who lets go of things easily. Even empires made of shag carpet and half-melted wax statues. You're still in your booth half tipsy. Entranced when Charles returns from somewhere backstage, clutching a dusty scrapbook. He sets it down with the reverence of a priest unboxing sacred texts and opens it slowly, like he's afraid the pages might crumble. Inside, a history of headlines, napkin doodles, Polaroids, business cards, lipstick smudges, and an entire page of drink receipts annotated like diary entries. This, he says, flipping to a page filled with yellowing clippings, is the chapter where they thought I was famous. And for a moment brief, ridiculous, and absolutely real, Charles was famous. It began with a feature in a national tabloid. It's one of those magazines you only buy in airports or during emotionally fragile grocery. Runs the headline, Napoleon's great-great-great-nephew opens Disco Kingdom in New Jersey. Below it, a photo of Charles in full faux military drag, standing beside a fog machine like it's an artillery cannon. His expression is a mix of pride and mild indigestion. Story itself was part fact, part flamboyantly fictionalized family lore. It mentioned Club Bonaparte as a glittering court of lights and longing, referred to Marvin as the Duke of Disco, implied heavily that Charles had once received a telegram from the French government requesting he return to Europe to restore style to the Republic. He had not. But the damage was done. Other papers picked it up. A late-night host made a joke about the Bonaparte of Bergen, a talk show producer even called, hoping to book him for a history-themed dance-off segment. Charles declined partially out of dignity. Partially because he didn't own a working phone at the time. Historians still argue. Whether this tabloid wave helped or hurt the club, the foot traffic spiked briefly. Tourists showed up. College kids took Polaroids with the Napoleon bust and mispronounced Westphalia. A French travel writer came by, stayed for 14 minutes, and published a review that simply read, "Non." But for Charles, it was a moment of magic. Proof that the fantasy wasn't just his. That somewhere, someone believed even only between folding laundry and flipping through a grocery aisle impulse buy, that he was royalty. He flips another page. There's a black and white photo of him and Edie mid-dance. She's wearing a sash that says Liberty. He's wearing a red velvet jacket, and the kind of grin that could only be powered by canned fog and emotional confusion. Below it, caption reads in thick ballpoint, "This is real, even if it shouldn't be." Charles closes the scrapbook gently. "You know," he says, his voice softer now, "there's something oddly noble about keeping a thing alive that doesn't really need to exist. I mean, look around. No one's throwing parades for Bonaparte-themed cocktail lounges. There's no grant money for this," he laughs. "But for a minute, people looked at me and said, hey, maybe legacy isn't just about statues. Maybe it's about keeping a jukebox working." You can't argue with that, because while Charles may not have conquered Europe, or even managed to conquer the mold problem in the east wall of the club, he did something arguably harder. He built a space where people felt like they belonged, where being too much wasn't a flaw, was the dress code. Tabloid fame faded, of course, as all minor folklore eventually does. The next week's issue focused on a dog that could allegedly say pancakes. But for a brief, strange window of time, Club Bonaparte was a curiosity across America, a punchline in some places, a pilgrimage in others. A piece of living historical fiction with a fog machine budget and a broken mop sink. Charles tells you that one night, a woman drove down from upstate New York just to see the place. She'd read about it on a message board and showed up in full 18th century gown. He offered her a drink. She pulled out a handwritten speech and asked if she could read a monologue from La Marseillaise before taking a seat. "I let her," he says. "I gave her the throne. Let her DJ for 20 minutes. She picked 5 songs from a burned CD labeled Revolution Jams Volume 2. They were all remixes of Chopin. It was awful. It was perfect. And that really was the heart of it, Club. Bonaparte was never trying to be cool. It was trying to be unforgettable. And in doing so, it stumbled into something rare. Authenticity by accident. People came expecting a joke and found themselves dancing barefoot under a mirrored bust of Napoleon while whispering confessions to strangers dressed as dukes. It didn't always make sense, but then again, neither did history. And as Charles wipes a speck of dust off the scrapbook and slides it back into a drawer lined with old drink coasters and an unused tiara labeled Minister of Cocktails, you realize something? You don't have to be important to matter. You just have to last long. Enough for someone to notice the glitter. At some point in the evening or maybe morning now, depending on how time behaves under fluorescent chandeliers, You find yourself sitting with Charles in what he calls the war room, just the storage closet behind the bar, but there's a small table, an old ledger, and a coat rack that holds nothing but epaulets and broken dreams. This is where he did the books. This. Charles says, flipping open a faded notebook is where I learned that the IRS doesn't care if you're technically descended from a guy who once pretended to be king of a German ghost kingdom. The entries are heartbreaking, beautiful, meticulously notated. July 1983. Sold 6 Robespierre's Revenge cocktails. Lost 3 to spillage. Net gain, $4.25. August 1984. DJ didn't show. Played Revolutionary War Fafan drum cassette instead. Mixed reviews? You watch his finger trace the ink lines of his empire's collapse. It's easy to forget, mid the glitter and goofiness, that this story cost him more than money. It cost him years. Relationships, security, possibly a better dental plan. But he never stopped. Even as the club became a parody of its former self. Even as the ice machine turned into an ongoing inside joke. Even when the fog machine began sputtering smoke like it had witnessed too much and was trying to disappear itself, he kept the doors open until there was no door left to open. The final nail in the royal coffin came from the IRS. A letter. A warning. A deadline. You know how it ends. Club Bonaparte. Wasn't the kind of business that recovered from audits. Charles didn't fight it. There comes a point, he says, where you realize the kingdom is just you and a ledger full of IOUs. And at some point, even Napoleon stopped rebuilding. Historians still argue whether the original Bonaparte line should have died with Napoleon on St. Helena. Technically, there were claimants for years and fews, cousins, great and fews once removed, but the heart had gone out of it. Empires don't end with a bang. They end with paperwork. And Charles, it turns out, had paperwork, lots of it. Debt statements. Letters from liquor vendors. A particularly aggressive letter from someone demanding payment for a custom fog fluid blend called Eau de Glory. There's even a note from a local historian offering to take some of the portraits off your hands for preservation purposes. Charles. Kept that one taped to the wall with a sticky note underneath? No. Not until the smoke clears. The night the club closed for good, the IRS padlocked the front door. No ceremony. No fanfare. Just a man in a windbreaker, a chain, and a clipboard. Charles wasn't even allowed inside to collect all the props. He waited until they left, then snuck in through the back, grabbed the Napoleon bust, and left everything else behind. It felt like escaping Elba, he says. Except instead of a horse, I had a borrowed bicycle and a plastic crown in my pocket. The next few years were strange, quiet. He worked odd jobs, hosted trivia nights at a chain restaurant, taught a history seminar at a community college, titled Failed Empires and the Power of Vibes. No one ever showed up. Eventually, he settled into a kind of semi-retirement, occasional speaking gigs, birthday parties where he was paid in beer to dress as Napoleon and yell motivational quotes at accountants, but he never stopped telling the story. And now, here you are, sitting on a stack of retired bar stools, listening to him tell it again, more wistful than proud, but still somehow glowing, because even if the IRS doesn't recognize royalty, even if creditors don't honor the constitution of fog and funk drafted in the back of a disco lounge, even if the dance floor has been paved over and turned into a yoga studio, ... Charles Bonaparte was a king. For a little while, to a handful of loyal citizens, with breadsticks and bass lines, he ruled, and when it all fell apart, he kept the crown in a box under his bed just in case the people ever called him back. You ask him what he would have done differently? He thinks for a long moment, got a second ice machine, says, then grins, and maybe charged more. For the cheese plate, you laugh, because there's nothing else to do, really. In the end, the empire was beautiful, bizarre, doomed, and glorious, and also slightly sticky, like all the best stories. It's just past 2 a.m. now, technically the ghost hour. If this were a haunted house instead of a velvet-trapped monument to failed royalty and fog machines, the music has slowed to a dreamy trickle. Only a handful of patrons remain. All regulars. No one's in a rush. There's nowhere else they'd rather be. Charles stands at the center of the dance floor. Arms crossed, eyes closed, swaying slightly. You almost expect him to give one last toast. Instead, he points to the DJ booth and says, "Play the waltz." And then miraculously, the final night at Club Bonaparte begins again. This is it. The last dance. The one everyone still talks about in those nostalgic, slightly tipsy tones that suggest maybe they're embellishing, maybe not. The nightclub Bonaparte said goodbye in full costume, full chaos, full camp, a blaze of glitter, bittersweetness, and one absolutely doomed fondue fountain. The theme was the Tuileries Ball, Charles's idea, naturally. Everyone had to dress in some version of post-revolutionary elegance. Lace, feathers, sashes, powdered wigs. People spent weeks preparing. Edie made her own dress out of her grandmother's curtains and sequined table runners. Marvin bought a powdered wig off a theater troupe that had just done Les Miserables. It was too tall for the car, so he wore it out the window like a peacock. On a convertible tour, even the skeptical locals came, because word had spread. Club Bonaparte was closing for good. Some came to dance, some came to laugh, some came to see if Charles would cry. Spoiler, he didn't. He radiated. He greeted each. Guest at the door in full uniform epaulets polished, boots shined, ceremonial saber plastic at his side. Every person got a title. The man from the deli, Duke of Cold Cuts. The teenager from the laundromat, Baroness of Fabric Softener. The mail carrier who once delivered a CSN desist, Marshal of the early morning dispatch. At 9 p.m., he climbed onto a milk crate repainted to look like a marble pedestal and gave his final address. He spoke in perfect faux French cadence, reading from a crumpled scroll. Friends, Bonapartists, patrons of dance and questionable drinks. Tonight, we say, au revoir, not with sorrow, but with style. The crowd cheered. Let history forget our receipts, but remember our moves. The crowd screamed. Then the lights dimmed. The fog machine wheezed into life. And the first notes of a disco-infused Strauss waltz filled the room. The dance floor exploded. Couples spun. Friends collided. Marvin lost a shoe. Someone shouted Liberté and flung a glitter cannon. No one knew where it came from. It didn't matter. At the snack table, the fondue fountain malfunctioned dramatically, launching molten cheese onto a man in breeches. Declared it a glorious wound in the service of flavor. People clapped. Historians still argue whether the fondue incident was preventable or simply an inevitable result of combining dairy and revolution, and Charles. Charles danced with everyone, slow, fast, silly, grand. He dipped a 70-year-old bartender, named Maria, so low her orthopedic heels snapped. She called him a scoundrel and kissed him on the cheek at midnight. The lights cut silence, then a spotlight jury-rigged from a desk lamp, and some red cellophane lit the Napoleon bust above. The bar Charles raised his glass and said simply, "Let them remember we were ridiculous." And that was it. The last toast. The last song. The final shuffle on a floor that had hosted decades of laughter, its confusion, trivia nights, and line dancing revolutions. No one left immediately. They lingered, took photos, took napkins, took a breadstick. As a souvenir, Edie pocketed her Minister of Cheese sash. Marvin tearfully handed his wig to a teenager who promised to carry the funk forward. Charles stood at the door and hugged everyone goodbye. When the last guest left, he locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat at the bar with Sal. They split a bottle of cheap champagne, poured into mismatched teacups. Neither of them said much. There wasn't anything left to say. Club Bonaparte was gone, but not dead, because can't kill a place like that. Not really. It survives in photos, in memories, in the glitter still stuck in people's coat linings, in the stories they tell their kids about that weird club with the powdered wigs, and the guy who said he was a prince but also knew a surprising amount about municipal tax, codes, and sometimes on certain nights. When the fog rolls just right and the bass line hits just low enough, you might catch a whiff of warm gin and roses and swear you hear someone whisper, "Long live the lounge." You step outside into the quiet hush of early morning. That in-between time where nightclubs have shut down but bakeries haven't yet opened. The parking lot of Club Bonaparte now just a patch of cracked asphalt overgrown at the edges sits. Under the flickering glow of a street lamp that's been threatening to quit since 1994, Charles follows behind you, carrying 2 paper cups of what he calls victory coffee. It tastes like nostalgia, cardboard, and just a hint of cinnamon. He hands you one and gestures toward the curb like it's a royal balcony. You both sit in silence for a moment. I still dream about it, he says. Not the parties, the setup. You glance over, the chairs, the lights, getting the fog machine to not sound like a distressed llama. That stuff, the part where you build it. Because after the club closed, Charles didn't vanish. He moved. Yes, temporarily to his sister's basement in Teaneck, where he spent a year digitizing old records and submitting trivia questions too. A radio station under the pseudonym Count Funula. But the Bonaparte in him never let go. Over the years, he reappeared in odd places. A New Jersey cable access show where he hosted Napoleon's Nuggets, a 5-minute weekly history. Segment sandwiched between community announcements and used car ads. A local 4th of July parade, riding in a rented convertible under a banner that read, Prince of Past Parties. And once in a blink and jewel miss it moment, he was quoted in a national magazine article about quirky American nightlife. Just a line, some people build empires, some people build discos. Historians still argue whether Charles's post-club appearances helped preserve the myth, coyly buried it under layers of irony. He never chased fame again. But he never stopped telling the story to anyone willing to sit still through it. And what about the rest of the Bonapartes? You ask him this as the caffeine starts to kick in. Oh, we're around, he says, eyes twinkling. Scattered, faded, still mildly delusional, somewhat corporate. One cousin opened a dental supply business in Delaware and calls his shop Bonaparte by Cuspid. Another writes historical romance novels under the pen name E. Boner. A few drifted out of the name entirely, embarrassed by its odd weight, its shelf life of confusion, but others leaned in. There's an urban legend about a Bonaparte descendant who runs a vineyard in California and insists on being called Comte de Cabernet. There's another allegedly who tried to organize a Bonaparte family reunion cruise, but accidentally booked it on a cargo ferry to Nova Scotia. Charles confirms none of these stories, but he doesn't deny them either. You know what they say? He shrugs. Every family has its exiled monarch, its tax evader, and its disco enthusiast. You both laugh, because of course, legacy is like that. Gets blurry, rewritten. Sometimes it survives in textbooks. More often it survives in birthday toasts and weird photo albums. A few years ago, a graduate student tracked down Charles for an oral history project. They came with a voice recorder, a clipboard, and the hopeful gleam of someone who thinks the past might reveal something meaningful, if you just ask it the right way. They interviewed him for 4 hours. At the end, they asked, "Do you consider yourself a descendant of Napoleon?" Charles paused. "No," he said. "I consider myself a descendant of Betsy. And isn't that the truest line in the whole saga? Because Betsy's scandalous, brilliant, banned from France, but never from Baltimore society, was the heart of the story. She's the reason there was a Beau, a Charles, a club, a ridiculous, fabulous empire built on fog and family pride. She wasn't royalty, but she acted like it. She demanded it. And in a way, her legacy survived longer than any Bonaparte on a throne. That graduate student eventually published their thesis. Ballrooms and breadsticks, the role of thematic spaces in historical imagination. Charles has a printed copy, bound and laminated in his glove compartment. Just in case, he says. Just in case what? In case someone forgets who we were. You finish your coffee and rise from the curb. The sun is starting to edge over the horizon. Somewhere, a bird sings. Somewhere else, a former Napoleon impersonator is probably ironing his cape. Before you leave, Charles reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small, worn token. It's a laminated drink ticket from the very last night of Club Bonaparte. One side, Reeds admit one revolution, the other in Sharpie. No expiration date. He presses it into your palm. Take it, he says. You never know when you might need to start an empire. You step back inside one final time. The air is still, the fog machine long cold, the scent of nostalgia clinging to every threadbare curtain and battered disco tile. You run your fingers along the edge of the bar, once a battlefield of drink. Orders, love confessions, bad jokes, and the occasional deeply misunderstood trivia round, and it all comes rushing in, the music, the glitter, the powdered wigs, the crowns made of pipe cleaners. The epic drama of a man who declared himself royalty in a polyester kingdom and made it stick if only for a few incredible years. You walk slowly across the floor, past empty booths, named after forgotten siblings of a French emperor, past the crooked sign that still reads L'Empire c'est nous, and past the Napoleon bust now sitting humbly atop a stack of dish racks. There's a quiet reverence in the silence now. Not mourning, but memory. And the funny thing is, Club Bonaparte isn't. Even that unusual, once you really think about it. All across America, there are strange little places, bowling alleys turned into tiki lounges. Laundromats that double as poetry slams, barbecue joints with Egyptian themes, and absolutely no historical justification. These are not just businesses. They're monuments to someone's weird, unshakable dream. Historians still argue whether such places contribute meaningfully to culture or just clutter the economic landscape with novelty. But those historians probably never danced under a disco ball shaped like Napoleon's hat while sipping a Corsican Cosmo and shouting the lyrics to Dancing Queen. In a sash that says First Consul of Funk, places like this aren't about efficiency. They're about expression and Charles. He understood that better than most. He didn't run a club. He ran a stage, a throne room, fever dream. A love letter to every lost ambition that still deserves a spotlight. Even after the club shut down, he never really stopped. There were pop-ups, one-night events, a traveling trivia show called The Road to Elba. Once, he rented a VFW hall and turned it into a 2-hour Napoleonic escape room. The clues made no sense. The decor fell down. It was, by all accounts, a triumph, because the dream never died. It just got mobile. You wonder what happened to the fog machine? Thrown. The drinks menu written in 3 languages, none of them accurate. You wonder if Charles will ever open another club or if he's content now? Passing on the legacy one story at a time, one laminated drink ticket at a time. But most of all, you wonder what people said when they left Club Bonaparte for the last time. Some probably laughed. Some probably cried. Some probably vowed never again to drink something called Yelb in Exile. But some, just a few, walked out into the Jersey night air, blinking against the streetlights, and felt something change. Because once you've danced in a room that took itself just seriously enough, once you've worn a sash and been called Minister of Mischief without irony, once you've seen a man declare a foggy booth sacred well, you don't forget that. You carry it with you in your walk, in your weird, in your unapologetic sparkle. Maybe you don't build an empire, but maybe, just maybe, you tell the story, and that's how it survives. So now as we leave Club Bonaparte behind, its lights dimmed, its crown slightly crooked, its jukebox humming, quietly into memory, let your breath slow just a bit. The night is soft now. No more fog machines. No more revolution-themed appetizers. Just the slow rhythm of a fading dance floor and the quiet knowledge that somewhere out there, someone kept a dream alive with glitter and grit. Imagine the chandeliers swaying gently in the dark. Imagine the last echo of laughter bouncing off mirrored walls. Imagine Charles, one hand on the jukebox, the other raising a glass to nobody and everybody. In this calm, you can almost hear the stories resting, waiting for their next dance, or next telling. You don't have to be a Bonaparte to leave a mark. You just have to be brave enough to throw the party. So take a deep breath. Let it out slowly, and allow the velvet curtains of sleep to fall gently. Around you, let go of the tax returns, the drink specials, the strange smell coming from the back hallway, and drift. because in some small way, you were there too. You were part of the empire, even if just for one sleepy, wonderful night. Of script, sweet dreams.